Um, Today, we're also going to have a look at the ongoing situation in Lebanon. Um, Obviously, Lebanon hit international news last year with that shocking explosion in Beirut. However, Lebanon has faced numerous other problems over the past few months and even years. Kit, you're very clued up on Middle East affairs. Do you want to try and explain to us what exactly's been going on in Lebanon?
Well, the port explosion has acted as a catalyst to what we've seen in recent days. So over the last few days, we've seen violence, gunfire, RPG fire erupting on the city streets in Beirut. The consensus that I've seen so far is that Hezbollah is taking to the streets in force. And part of the reason for that is as a move against the judge who is investigating the port explosion. That's Judge Tarek Bitar, who is investigating it. And my understanding is that there is some controversy as to whether he should be removed from that position, that investigation. This is the culmination of months and years of very profound issues that have been affecting the country. You have recently a nationwide blackout in the country. The national grid is more or less completely unable to support itself. It's completely reliant upon oil imports, heavy diesel imports from places like Iraq and places like Iran as well. The power stations that they do have supporting the national grid are completely out of date. They're inefficient. They can only produce a few hours of electricity a day. For the rest of the time, people are completely reliant on private generators, which are technically illegal, but are pretty much propping up people's power supply at the moment as well. This affects life in so many different ways as well. It can mean like something as simple as you can't keep the refrigerator on because you can't have a power supply overnight. You can't use the lift to take water up to your flat because tap water isn't drinkable. This is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. It's only been getting worse in recent times. So there are oil imports which are en route to the country. But of course, now that you have unrest breaking out on the streets in major cities, including the capital Beirut, it's very difficult to see how this situation could improve in the next few weeks, really. It's very, very unsettling, very unnerving. I have seen a few people that have been, a few commentators who have been basically, it's difficult to see anything other than maybe pushing towards a second civil war, which would be absolutely awful for the country. When you have so many different factions in place, so many different tensions, people are extremely disillusioned. You have Hezbollah now really coming out in force in the streets of Beirut. You have the small matter of over 1 million Syrian refugees living in the country, which is worth mentioning, many of whom will not be very big fans of Hezbollah because Hezbollah have been instrumental in helping to prop up the Assad regime in Syria. You also have Palestinian refugee camps in the south of the country as well. There's an ongoing problem with that in that what is left of the Lebanese government refuses to acknowledge the citizenship of the Palestinians that are living in Lebanon. They don't grant them Lebanese citizenship because to do that would undermine the Palestinian cause, basically. That's the argument that's taken. In the meantime, people who are literally born in the country, many of them haven't even been to Palestine, are still not granted that citizenship. So there's an awful lot of different people with different conflicts of interests. And in the meantime, you have a failing national grid. You've had a debt crisis. You've had complete disillusionment in the ability to actually change the situation and the government's ability to actually change the situation. It's worth remembering as well that despite a huge protest movement in the country, which for many was seen as like a turning point, the same person who was ousted from power by that mass protest movement, Rafiq Hariri, has come back in power again. He returned to power despite that. And many people see that as kind of exemplifying the levels of corruption, the levels of the fact that there's kind of two different stratas in society as well. And I think it's awful that even now, while the investigation into the awful port blast, which again itself was a culmination of years of neglect, years of incompetence. Remember, we had thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate just sitting in Beirut port, and there's evidence to suggest that the authorities knew that it was there and did nothing about it. It really does exemplify the levels of, I think, incompetence at the levels of government that we have. Many people that I've spoken to as well are now describing Lebanon as a failed state. Some leading commentators are describing it that way. Whether it is at the moment is difficult to say, but if things don't get any better, I don't see how it can go any other way.
Of course, in the Middle East, more recently, if we look beyond the borders of Lebanon, what a lot of commentators often describe is this power play among many of these conflict-ridden Middle Eastern nations, notably between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Where does Lebanon fit into that conflict?
Well, it's an interesting point, actually, because of course, one of the main and most powerful factions in Lebanon is Hezbollah, who are very heavily affiliated with Iran. They are a Shia sect. Iran is the only kind of formally Shia country that is completely like Shia through and through. On the other hand, the connection with Saudi Arabia is quite interesting because there is the extraordinary moment in recent Lebanese history where the prime minister was effectively held hostage by Saudi Arabia for I can't remember exactly for how long, but the point is he was there on a diplomatic mission on government business and was not allowed to leave the country. So they've effectively kidnapped the prime minister of another nation. It's still not entirely clear what the motivation was for Saudi Arabia to do that. It's possible that it was a way of pushing the kingdom's interest in the country, which is becoming, increasingly beholden to Hezbollah, which is becoming increasingly beholden to Iranian influence in many ways, potentially. But yeah, it's definitely something that the two countries are interested in. I think it's becoming very much a bit of a playground for a lot of the larger forces which are kind of moving through the region at the moment.
Okay. For people who aren't so in tune with Middle Eastern affairs, could you briefly explain a bit of the background as to what Hezbollah is?
Okay, so Hezbollah is one of the parties in Lebanon. It also, of course, has a military wing. It's a Shia organization, Shia Muslim organization. It's very, very conservative, socially conservative in its outlook. It has a parliamentary wing, and it also has a military wing as well, which is what we've been seeing coming out in force in the streets of Beirut over the last few days. It has quite a large presence in the south of the country as well. We've seen over the last few weeks and the last few months, the movement has been starting to try and launch rockets into Israel again. There's been some very interesting and very disturbing footage of citizens in the south of Lebanon directly intervening to stop that from happening, because they know it would be terrible for the country. It would be suicidal at this stage.
Because of course, Israel occupied much of southern Lebanon for many years.
Exactly. Yes. Hezbollah have previously been able to go toe-to-toe with Israel, but it's very difficult to see how that would play out very well for them at this stage, because Lebanon simply does not have the infrastructure or the ability to support anything like that. It can't even sustain itself in sort of day-to-day business at the moment, let alone trying to kind of kick the hornet's nest in the south of the country, as it were. But yeah, to get back to Hezbollah, it's a Shia movement. It's very heavily affiliated with Iran. It's very heavily backed by Iran. Many people view it as an Iranian proxy in Lebanon. As I said before, it's been very heavily involved in the Syrian civil war as well. There's been Hezbollah fighters crossing the border over into Syria to fight on behalf of the Assad regime. So yeah, it's also viewed as a very kind of militant and difficult party to deal with, because in addition to their parliamentary wing, they do also have the military wing as well, the paramilitary wing.
Okay.
Basically, it's not someone that you would annoy lightly, I think, is the long and short of it.
I mean, that almost draws me on to my next point, because I've seen some commentators even suggesting that Lebanon may be on collision course for civil war. If that were to manifest itself, who would we be looking at as the main players in that conflict? And presumably, of course, it would be absolutely devastating for an already devastated country. Who would be the main power players looking to gain from the war?
I mean, it's difficult to say at this stage, and all you can really do is look at the people who are present in the country at the moment. Of course, you have Hezbollah is a major player in this, but there's also a very large Sunni minority in Lebanon as well, who are really not very keen on Hezbollah as a movement. Exactly what kind of shape that minority would take is not really clear at the moment. As I mentioned before, you have more than 1 million Syrian refugees living in the country who will not be, many of whom will not be keen on Hezbollah because of their role in the Syrian civil war. And then you have Palestinian refugees in the south who have become increasingly disenfranchised over the last few years. There's also Christian groups in the country as well. Again, it's very, very difficult to say at this stage exactly how it would play out. It's impossible, really. But I think it's fair to say that we would have groups kind of splintering off possibly down these lines, but it's very difficult to say at this stage, really. If you look at the last civil war in Lebanon as well, a lot of the groups that did splinter off tended to be down sectarian lines as well. So yeah, you had Shia sects, you had Sunni sects, you had Christian, and then I think there were Palestinian sects as well. It's messy, basically, is what I'm saying. It's not just one side against another. I think if it did spiral off into that situation, it's not going to be one side against another. It's going to be very, very messy.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Kit. And thank you very much, everyone else, for tuning in. This has been the Redaction News Roundup. And please remember to subscribe, click the bell to get notified of our latest videos. You can find all our print content, our written content on redactionpolitics.com. And if you're feeling especially generous, we're also on Patreon, and we'd be eternally grateful if you dropped us just as little as $1 US. But for now, it's bye from me, bye from Kit, and we'll see you all next time.